The views, comments, and opinions of the following program do not necessarily reflect those of Morris Media Studios, MorrisMediaLive.com, or its affiliates. Listener discretion is advised.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge.
It's time to get it straight. No chaser with Jasmyne Cannick.
Overall, it's just a good thing.
Tap into the conversation. Check 1, 2. As Jasmyne covers the latest issues affecting our community and the world.
It is absolutely vital that the truth comes out.
This is Straight No Chaser with Jasmyne Cannick.
Let's go, man.
Hey everyone, let's go. Happy Friday. Welcome back to Straight No Chaser with your host, me, Jasmyne Cannick. I am so happy to be back this week. I'm doing part 4 in my Beyond the Protest series, which basically looks at strategies for moving forward beyond the protest to make real systemic change, looking at everything from how to get an independent prosecutor to battling the police unions. This week, we are going to be talking about qualified immunity, and I'm so excited about that because I've been seeing a lot of chit-chat about qualified immunity on social media, and some of it has bothered me a little bit, especially things like, oh, let's talk to our council member about striking qualified immunity down. And I'm like, we need to talk about this because people need to be educated on exactly what it is. And I'm not an attorney. I work with a lot of attorneys, but I'm not one. So what I decided to do was put a panel together of some of the greatest attorneys, most brilliant people that I know, particularly on this subject. And they were so gracious to come in today and join me on this podcast to explain to you what qualified immunity is, but not only what it is, but how we can move forward in terms of dismantling it, because that seems to be the renewed conversation in the public right now, particularly with people who have just woken up and have just learned the term qualified immunity and what it means. So let me please introduce my guests for today. And again, I'm so grateful that they're here. One of them is one of my closest friends, attorney Nana Gyamfi, who is in studio with me. Nana Gyamfi is an attorney. She's a human and civil rights activist. She is a criminal defense attorney. She's also the executive director of the Black Alliance for Justice and Immigration. She has previously worked as an adjunct professor in the Pan-African Studies Department at Cal State LA. And she hosted a radio show and her own podcast called Conversations on the Way, the Asafo edition. She's also the founder of the Community Legal Clinic and Transformative Justice Center and Legalese workshops, as well as the co-founder of Justice Warriors for Black Lives. Welcome, Nana.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
I'm so excited that, I worked really closely with this next person I'm going to introduce, and I'm so happy that beyond the campaign, our relationship is still intact and we're still fighting the good fight. Rachael Rossi is joining us by Skype. Rachael Rossi is the first former public defender to run for LA County District Attorney. She spent her career fighting for marginalized communities as a public defender in LA state and federal courts, and through criminal justice reform as a criminal justice policy expert. Her combined litigation and policy experience uniquely positions her to bring true change to LA's broken criminal justice system. I so much believe that, and that is such an accurate way to describe her. Rachael, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yay. And last but certainly not least is another brilliant attorney who is just making waves all over the place. Jamon Hicks with Hicks Law. Jamon Hicks practices law in the area of civil litigation and criminal defense, representing plaintiffs in state and federal courts. His civil litigation experience involves wrongful death, serious personal injury, and police misconduct cases. He has also litigated numerous felony and misdemeanor criminal cases, such as attempted murder, assault on peace officers, terrorist threats, driving under the influence, drug and gun possession matters. Jamon joins us by phone. Jamon, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Jasmine. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So before the show started, I was telling Rachael that, you know, and I know you know this, Nana, 60 minutes goes by really quickly, especially when you're talking about something that you're super passionate about, right? And so we're not going to waste any time. We're going to jump right into it. And I think to set the tone of the conversation, we should first discuss what qualified immunity is. And any one of you three can feel free to jump in and answer that. But could you please just explain to the average person who knows nothing about the law and what qualified immunity is, but sees it on social media and just likes to retweet and share things?
Okay, so I think Jamon is best to answer this question, but I'm going to lead it in for him.
Okay.
I'm going to be one of those community members and say, you know, the police did it on purpose. They knew that I was not the person, and they went and they got me anyway. I'm ready to sue. Then they go to Jamon. What does Jamon tell them?
What do you tell them, Jamon?
I tell them that it's not that simple and it's not that easy. I think one thing that people don't necessarily understand about qualified immunity is that we're talking about in the civil context and not in the criminal context. So when a person brings a lawsuit against the police in federal court, that's also an important distinction. This is federal court, not state court. In federal court, qualified immunity provides a defense to the police officers. It gives them an immunity that if they're acting in their capacity as police officers, even if the force that is used is reasonable or unreasonable, the qualified immunity doctrine states they have to know that they're violating a clearly established right, which is very, very legalese for saying they have to realize and know that when they're doing the act that they're doing, they're violating somebody's right. So the best way to really explain is to give an example. And I'll use, since George Floyd is a very popular, even Rashard Brooks, those are the two most popular cases that everybody understands the facts about, right?
Okay.
If and when the officers are sued in both of those cases, what they will say is the focus is not going to be about whether or not the force was reasonable or unreasonable. I think we can all agree, especially in George Floyd, that the force was unreasonable. The issue is going to become, did the officer know when he was kneeling on George Floyd's neck that he was violating his constitutional rights? Now, it seems like a very common sense argument to say, of course he had to know he was violating his constitutional rights. But what he will say, even though there's video to disprove this, what he will argue is, at the time I was putting my knee in his neck, I didn't realize that I was inflicting the type of force that would possibly cause him to die. I didn't realize that I was using force that was excessive. I was merely trying to hold him down because he was resisting. It was a terrible tragedy. I didn't mean it. That will be the defense. And then a judge will have to make a determination if, one, the force that was used was unreasonable, and even if the judge gets past the first prong, the second prong is, did he know when he was kneeling on his neck that he was clearly violating an established constitutional right? So in very quick form, that's basically qualified immunity is a complete defense to the officers. Because if the judge determines, yes, that even if the force was excessive, that he was not violating a clearly established right, the case is then dismissed and it never even gets to a jury.
Okay, let me jump in here. I want to play a quick video right quick and get reaction from all three of you, okay? This is a video that was put on social media. I think someone first put it on TikTok, and then it made its way to Facebook and Twitter. And I want to get your reaction to this. Poetess?
Hey, can you... Why did you do that?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. It's just
I thought you were going to slap me first. Okay, well, I feel like you should still get in trouble.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, we can get the teacher in here.
Is there a problem here? Yeah, he slapped me. He should get in trouble, right? Has he slapped people before? Yeah. And did he get in trouble then? No. Okay, so according to the rules, he can't get in trouble now. Wait, what? That doesn't... Did you see that? He just slapped me again. Has he done this before? Yeah, it literally just happened. And did he get in trouble then? No. Okay, so according to the rules, he can't get in trouble now. Wait, I'm sorry, what kind of rule? This can't be legal. It is. It is, yeah. Can I slap him? No, he's special. You would go to...
Okay. And what?
I saw that this morning. I could not stop laughing. I mean, I don't think it's an exactly correct description of the law, but it does bring up something that Jamon talked about with the clearly established. How do we know that it's clearly established law? And what many of the circuits, many of the courts are saying is, you got to find a case where the court said you can't do this. And so there's cases, for example, where people have been tased and beaten, and the court has said, oh, yes, that violates the Constitution. But then in another case, a person was pepper sprayed, and the court has said, like in the Fifth Circuit, oh, well, you know what? That was pepper spray, though. That wasn't tased and beaten, so it's not clearly established to that person, that cop at that time, that this violates the law. So it can get really tricky when you're trying to say that it violates clearly established law, because we look at it and we're like, those rights have been violated, but it's not that simple.
Okay, Rachel, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I'll just add, at a very basic level, that there's two things here that are important. Number one, we're talking about federal law. So I think it's very important when people are discussing qualified immunity at a very basic level, we're talking about something that we need either the Supreme Court or Congress to weigh in on if we want to change it, right? And number two, I think it's very important to remember that it's an immunity. It precludes you from even really getting to trial, from even really getting into litigating a lot of these issues, because it says very early on in a case that a cop or a law enforcement officer or a government official should be immune from being able to be sued. So I think that those are important things to keep in mind as well. And one example I saw that I think kind of shows some of the picture, there was a California case where officers were executing a search warrant. So they were searching someone's house and they stole $250,000. And that person wanted to sue law enforcement to get their money back. And the court said, well, let's see, has there been another case in this jurisdiction where we found previously that stealing while you're searching after a search warrant is illegal? Have we ever decided that before? And the court found that no, in California, in the Ninth Circuit, that had not been decided before. And so that person was precluded from bringing that lawsuit against those officers. So that's just kind of an example of how it can work in a very unfair sort of.
Yeah, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
What do I tell you about the law all the time, Jasmine? The law is not rooted in sense. The law is rooted in protection of certain people. And I think it's important because the courts literally said, we're doing this because we want to protect law enforcement. And not just law enforcement. Rachel, I really appreciate that you brought up government officials. Any government officials in the executive branch can also raise qualified immunity. And so think about it.
Oh, like our president?
How often would they want to actually change those things, right? And so it's, those pieces do go together in terms of pushing back and how we're able to get this gone, especially if we're depending on Congress and our lovely Supreme Court.
Which my next question was going to be, what was the history of qualified immunity, the doctrine, the law, like what made it so? Like, why do we even have this doctrine, this law today, that says that government officials, including police officers, have this special immunity?
So this particular qualified immunity doctrine came in 1982. It was created by the Supreme Court. And when I say created, I'm talking about take the test tubes, mix the chemicals, poof, qualified immunity. Before that, you didn't have that. Before that, they looked at a good faith approach. So they said, is the officer's behavior, practicing saying officer is so hard, is the officer's behavior.
I appreciate you not using the P word today.
Thank you.
And using the officer.
Oh, I'm doing so
officer.
good. I'm being a good
I'll
good
take you
person.
out afterwards for a drink.
Thank you. So looking at the officer's behavior, the question was, did the officer act in good faith? And was their behavior reasonable? So it looked at a subjective piece, right, checking on where the officer was coming from, but then also looked at the objective reasonable standard. That still wasn't hot. It wasn't great. But at least things like stealing $250,000, that would clearly not be good faith, and that would clearly not be reasonable. That was in 1967 that they changed it to good faith and reasonable. And then in 82 is when this good faith immunity came up. And so this is not an old doctrine. I mean, the way people talk about it is it can never leave because it's as old as the Constitution. No, it's not. It's new.
Yeah, it's almost my age.
This is what I'm saying. It's low level Generation X.
Yes. I'm like, wow. Jamon, Rachel, did either of you want to weigh in on that?
The only thing I would say is the way that the police got involved in using this as a defense. Right. The idea, like if I'm playing devil's advocate and taking the other side, the idea is we don't want our officials, our elected officials, to have to always worry about being sued when they commit a certain act or a certain decision. Right. So police officers will say, and those that are proponents for qualified immunity will argue, I don't want a police officer when they have to make a quick decision whether or not to use force or not to use force, I don't want the police officer in the back of their mind to be thinking about, oh, I might get sued. It's the same thing with a doctor, right? If a doctor's performing a surgery, you don't want that doctor second-guessing themselves in the middle of that surgery for fear that they can get sued. That's what the argument is for with police officers. But in federal court, what it's done is shield police officers so much that to me, it's had the opposite effect, where now officers believe I'm Superman and I can do whatever I need to do, and I'm going to get off on this theory. So it had the wrong effect, and I think that especially in federal court, since most of these cases, these police cases are filed in federal court, it has made attorneys like myself and other civil rights attorneys decide, you know what? We don't want to deal with qualified immunity, so we're going to file our cases in state court. And I've seen less cases, police-wise, at least in Los Angeles and California, we're tending to file more in state court than we are in federal court, so we don't have to deal with qualified immunity.
Is there a good reason to keep qualified immunity around in 2020?
No, there wasn't a good reason in 1982. Like, they just created this thing as a total protection. And it's how ridiculous it is the police officers are not going to pay anyway. I wish the police officers paid. I'd be so happy. We could just wipe out their pensions. It would at least lower some numbers here. But the police officers aren't even going to pay.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about who actually pays.
Who actually pays is the government. If it's the city police officer, then it's the city government, which is the taxpayers.
That's what I was trying to get to. Yes,
exactly. And so. And you and I have talked about this. Like, I'm like, well, why don't the Taxpayer Association step in and say, look, you are costing us in the county, let's say with the sheriffs, or even with LAPD or others around the country, you're costing us tens of millions of dollars. This is unreasonable. Let's change the way this happens. Yeah. But that's not happening.
Yeah, Rachel, Jamon, did either of you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, all of the reasons that the Supreme Court sort of said when they created this law, we now see that the opposite effect has happened. The Supreme Court specifically said, we're scared that individual law enforcement officers will go bankrupt. We now see that it's a rare situation, if ever, that a law enforcement officer who is sued is actually paying out of pocket for that. We know it's most likely the taxpayer. Sometimes it could be insurance. Sometimes it could be unions, but it isn't the law enforcement officer himself. The Supreme Court also talked about the burden of litigation, also talked about specifically that they needed the immunity in order to be able to do their job effectively. And like Jamon said, we've seen the opposite. We've seen that this has actually caused less quality of officer care, I guess you could say. And we've seen that what it resulted in is more use of force instances because law enforcement does feel that they are immune from lawsuits.
So do you think the Supreme Court is likely to ever reconsider or change its view on qualified immunity given the current makeup of the court?
The makeup of the court today?
Yeah.
No.
No, not with the current makeup. I agree. No.
So
I would say, I'll step in and say, I've heard some experts say that at some point it is going to be inevitable that they can't hide any longer and they have to address this. I think our Supreme Court has surprised us, but no, I think, just this week or last week, the Supreme Court expressly decided they will not grant cert and they will not consider 8 of these cases. So they've actually sent the signal in a time where the country is asking for reform. The Supreme Court has said we're not going to take this issue up. And so I hope that in the future it's something that can be taken up by the Supreme Court, but this particular court has already said they're not going to.
And our Uncle Clarence, he's chomping at the bit. He wants one of these cases to come so badly.
Right.
Because he's ready. He's like, we're going to make it even stronger. We're going to go for absolute immunity. He's excited about the possibilities.
Well, explain to people what absolute immunity would be.
Absolute immunity would be what prosecutors have, which basically is you just can't sue them. They're so special that they're a part of the government that they just don't want you to sue them, period.
Even when they lie.
They would there'd be so many in jail right now.
And you know what, Jasmine, that brings up an interesting point because as a strategy, I've talked to attorneys when it comes to deciding whether or not we want to file an excessive force case in federal or state court. Let's say we're in federal court and then we lose on qualified immunity. Now we want to appeal. Now the concern is what happens if we do appeal and we make bad law. So like when the discussion is about whether or not absolute immunity would be on the table, which would make things worse, we're often kind of afraid to appeal certain rulings because of the current status of the court. What if they do hear the case and then it gets worse? So that's also the flip of it being heard by the court, is that it can make the situation a lot worse than it already is.
Wow. Rachael, I know that you've been following some of the bills in Congress right now. Can you explain what Congress is attempting to do, what looks like will pass, won't pass? Is it likely that we'll get any change?
So what we've seen in Congress is the Democrats on the House side, with the power that they have just yesterday actually passed a piece of legislation that would completely eliminate qualified immunity. What we've heard from the Republican-controlled Senate is that bill is dead on arrival. There's no way that they are going to take that up or consider it. I do think there is some hope, however, because we see that a Republican has introduced a bill on the Senate side that would create some modest changes to qualified immunity. Now, what I've heard is that for Democrats, that bill does not go far enough. That bill, and specifically that bill is called the Reforming Qualified Immunity Act, and that is Senator Braun from Indiana. What I've heard from Democratic offices is that the way that the bill is actually worded, it won't create nearly enough change, if at all. And so what I have heard is that there are still ongoing conversations, that there is some willingness from some of the key players on the Republican side to have conversations. But then we've heard, Tim Scott say any touching of qualified immunity is a poison pill and they're not going to consider it. So we do have, I think, a lot of leadership on the Republican side in the Senate that is staunchly opposed to doing anything to touch qualified immunity. And then we have a House that is Democratic controlled that wants to completely abolish qualified immunity. So I think where we are now is we're going to probably see a few more bills introduced in the coming weeks. We might see some some more dramatic bills on the Senate side, I think, more progressive bills that potentially seek to kind of partner with Republicans and see if there's something that can actually pass. And we might see some more modest bills be introduced. But at the end of the day, it's so complicated because you need it to go far enough and be progressive enough that the Democratic-controlled House is going to be okay with it. But you also need it to be moderate enough that you have Mitch McConnell putting it on the floor, right? And so I think what we see in November will also play into this. If there's any chance of the leadership in the Senate changing, that would make huge differences, obviously. But at this point, I think we should all just wait and see and pay very close attention.
Yeah, I think that you see my smile. Yes. I think that the Democratic bill, which of course, as an abolitionist, I think is like woefully below what it should be doing. But I think that that's for them, their high aspiration, knowing that it's going to be dead on arrival in the Senate. I think that the Democrats would be scared if that actually passed and went completely through.
So I'm going to pull over the car right there for a second. We're going to talk about that for a minute.
Okay.
Because I often feel that there are crap pieces of legislation that get thrown out there that they know is never going to make it through, but it's like, but we tried, we tried. And that's what it seems like you're saying. Like they knew that it was going to be dead on arrival, but now they can go back to their districts and say, vote me in for another 2 years. We did try.
So I wouldn't call it a crap piece of legislation. There are parts of it that I think I might describe that way. And there are parts of it that I think, like, you know, this qualified immunity piece that I believe Representative Presley pushed, that I think are really great. But I think people are like, okay, yeah, we'll put that in there. You know, it's like if I was there. And it's like, I think we should cut the budget in half. And they're like, okay, great. Okay, Nana, we can do that because we don't want you out here on the camera telling people that our thing is crap. So we'll go ahead and include that because we know that nobody's going for that. I mean, people should not forget your part 3 of this series. These unions exist. They are powerful.
Oh my
They
goodness.
didn't suddenly die. They have not cowered at all in the face of rebellion in the street. And they are the people that are putting money in people's pockets, not those of us who are rebelling in the streets. This is politics, right?
Right.
And that doesn't mean that rebellion doesn't have an effect. We know it does because the rebellion of black people got DACA for, the children who came here undocumented. It wouldn't have happened as far as we're concerned in the immigrant rights world without that rebellion of black people in the streets. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not saying it's nothing, but I am saying that we know that when we're in a position in which the Senate has so much control, that the Democrats are going to put some things out, and some of what they're going to put out is aspirational, which I like. I don't mind you putting out that aspiration. But I think when we're talking about what's going to happen later, I don't see the Republicans, like the most progressive Republican is like the most conservative of Democrats, okay? So they're not going to put up something that's going to actually be qualified immunity. And I think that we need to be aware of that, right? They'll call something Operation Hope, and it's about blowing up children. So the fact that they describe something as progressive doesn't mean that's actually what it is.
Yes, and I just wanted to add that I think that you bring up a very good point, that it's very important to look at what the language actually says and what the legislation will actually do, because you see this bill introduced by a Republican on the Senate side, and he's describing it as fixing the problem. And so in an area of the law like this, where it's very complex and confusing, it's very important to really kind of dig into it and see what is this reform actually going to do.
So let's say in a perfect world, we eliminate qualified immunity. Is that going to be the end of excessive use of force by law enforcement officers? Is that our our magic cure-all pill? Is that because if you listen to the folks who are they're now they want to be activists, they're out there fighting for what they believe in. It's like, okay, well, We need, to end qualified immunity. We need, and I'm gonna bring this up with y'all later on in this show. I do want to get your opinions on independent prosecutors, and we need a couple of other things. Let's say we get all of those things, right? Is that going to be the end of the police beating your ass when they feel like it? Ooh. Go ahead, Nana. Go ahead.
I'm using it in an adjective, so it should be okay. So the thing is that pigalicious officers are going to be pigalicious. Okay?
There you go.
This is a systemic thing. This is a deep-seated problem. And so eliminating qualified immunity, let's say that this was a wall that we were trying to make come down like in one of those video games. Eliminating qualified immunity is far down enough in the wall, right, close enough to the foundation, that it will have an effect. I'm not going to pretend it won't have an effect. Unlike training and more talking about blackness and cameras and all that, which will have no effect. That's like taking up the top layer of the wall. Qualified immunity is it's down enough that if you do something, it'll do something, but it's not going to eliminate everything. I mean, the system of policing is what the system of policing is. And so those of us that are saying there should be no policing should end, that is how you stop pigalicious cops from being pigalicious. You just don't have cops anymore.
And I'm going to have you back so we can have a deep, deep discussion on what this world would look like with no police.
Please do.
But because that's a conversation you and I have often.
And we need to have
we don't agree on it.
No, but I defer to my esteemed colleagues on this subject.
Jamon, Rachel, do you think that eliminating qualified immunity will be the cure-all, will be the end of excessive use of force by police officers on folks?
It's definitely not the cure-all. It's a step in getting the decision made by the jurors instead of the judge, right? So, again, what qualified immunity does is put it in the hands of this one judge. This one judge makes the determination, and if they say qualified immunity applies, boom, case is over, and it's never presented to a jury. So at least if we attack the qualified immunity doctrine, we can get more of these cases before the jury. Now, that brings up another set of issues as far as who's serving on these juries, right? But
right.
at least we're taking it out of the hands of just one person making a decision, and we're putting it in the hands of 8, or it depends on how many, because in federal court it can change based on the jurisdiction of how many jurors. But then that opens the question of who's serving on these jurors. And I don't know if you want to get into that discussion today, Jasmine.
No, we can. That's one of my favorite topics, Jamon, because again, when I look at beyond the protest, I'm looking at everything, right? Everyone who is engaged in this has a role in some way, right? And maybe your role is as a juror, but it will never come to fruition if you keep throwing away your jury summons or keep trying to get out of jury duty. And then you turn on the news and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe they sent him to prison for 235 years. Well, you didn't volunteer your services. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, feel free to. That is a huge issue in our community. And in how I look at it, it plays a significant role in, the criminal justice reform that, we are trying to make happen.
Absolutely, because I've been involved in cases, whether it's criminal, whether it's a police excessive force case, and the majority of my clients are black. And we'll be sitting there in trial. And even if you don't have, a lot of knowledge about what the case is about, if you're looking at me and you're looking at my client and you have even a fraction of what this case is about, you would think that black folks would say, you know what, this is one I need to listen to and give. I'm not saying you have to just go my way because I'm a black attorney. But what I'm saying is it probably presents that this may be a case that you need to be in the jury room so that you can let your voice be heard and hear everything else that's going on. And so many times I hear black people say what they need to say to try to get off of serving on the jury instead of saying honest things to see if they're going. I mean, it's one thing if they get kicked, right? Then I can do what I need to do to challenge the other side for kicking them. But when you are a black person that's deliberately trying to get out of jury service, that is as bad as the district attorney or the defense attorney that's trying to kick you just because you're black. And too many of our people, like you said, Jasmine, they get that jury summons and they just throw it away, or they don't respond, or they come to court and say what they need to say to get off, and then we have an excessive force case and no black people on the jury.
It's an issue. I think there's certain things that should happen that would help that, though, because most people, or a lot of people, let's say, do not get time off. Right. So they're not, if you're a government worker and you make yourself get off the jury, I am looking at you sideways. I'm like, okay, you get unlimited days, right? But for people that don't get unlimited days, it's a problem that you have to be there. What do they give you, $5, $10, something like that? And then, it's something really small. And so people are afraid and thinking to themselves, if this is going to be 7 days, no one's going to pay me back for that time. And in other countries, people are paid. Not that they're paid to be jurors, but they're covered. They're compensated more than $5 or $10 or $20, right, to be able to do that. If their employer can't pay, then there's a way that the government pays to make sure people are involved. And so I think we shouldn't take away from the fact that systemically the jury system is organized, number one, for us to not be able to be on if you're not in certain jobs, right? And number two, a lot of times what one of our comrades found out, if I remember his name, it'll come to me, Jamon, he found out that there were in the jury the jury commissioner was taking black people and sending them to traffic court. I think I talked to you about this, Jasmine, sending them to traffic court and not sending them to the felony CCB court downtown, but sending them to Hill Street as well. Whatever that Hill Street is down the street. Yeah. And so that's another piece. Systemically, we're not seeing them because they're not being sent to our cases. They're being sent to deal with DUIs and driving with suspended license cases. And we need to bark back about that, whether that be state court or those lower level type of cases in federal court.
And how we do that?
Well, he made the jury commissioner come to court and get on the stand and explain the situation. That was in state court. I don't know if we can do that with the feds, but I think we do need to press them. And, whether that's done as bar associations, whether that's done as, petitions, but I think there needs to be more pressure put on these commissions to make sure that they can't just say, oh, well, there's only 5 people in all of LA County anyway, or 5 people in the central district of the federal court, and so we don't have to do this. No, we have to make sure that we are counted properly. Yeah, that's my push for the census. And we have to make sure that these officials do what they're supposed to do with the representation we do have.
Do we, Rachael, Jamon, Nana, do we get annual statistics on the makeup of juries in our county reported back to the people, like, in 2019, 10% of, all jurors were African American? Or do we get any kind of statistics or anything that show us the age group, the race, or maybe even the areas within the county that the jurors are coming from?
I don't know. I'm sure you can gather information, but I don't know if they report that automatically. Jamon or Rachael, do you know? Especially with the federal juries, I really don't know.
That's a really
I don't.
I don't know.
That sounds like a report we could use.
But I do think so. I do think paying attention in this area is incredibly important, because I recall that there was a time when the pool that was selected for federal jury duty was changed, and it went from looking at voter registration to looking at driver's license registrations. And that started to change the ethnic makeup of who is on federal juries. So I do think that someone's tracking that data, or someone is it's likely out there. But I also think that, jury information is historically kept very confidential as well. So whether we would be able to get access to that, that's a different story. But I also think that what Nana brought up about judges is a crucial part of this too, because, when you have a law enforcement officer on the stand, when you have an issue where maybe you're challenging and saying that, the other side is kicking off a black juror, you have a judge there who is making the decision and making that call about whether to just ignore it whether to say that, that's nope, they can kick that black juror, that's fine, or whether to actually preclude that from happening. And so I think in our communities, we also have to really focus on who is running for judge. We also have obviously issues with federal judges because we have a president who is trying to fill the federal bench right now with very conservative judges. And traditionally, I think our community hasn't really paid attention. And this is an area where we do have some say and we do have an ability to push back and to try to get more representation of people that look like us on the bench. And so that's just my plug for looking at judicial races.
Well, every election, especially the ones that include judges, I do my voter recommendation guide. And one of the things I always say when it comes to the judicial offices is that I personally don't support electing deputy district attorneys, prosecutors from any branch of the government, because I just personally feel like that's helping to keep the system working against folks, right? Because who's going to be before them? Their former colleagues, their former coworkers. Have you guys had an experience with that? Do you feel the same way that when I hear what you're saying, Rachael, about we need to be very engaged in electing judges, and I absolutely agree, but should we be electing more criminal defense attorneys? Should we be electing, why is it that in this country, prosecutors are the only people that voters seem to elect as judges?
That is such a good question.
I try, girl. I try.
It really is. People just don't talk about it enough. I think that part of it is there's a lot of propaganda that actually is like prosecutor-ganda as well. So prosecutors are people who, according to what we're taught by TV, literally, fight for the truth. And they're all about the truth. And defense attorneys, like the folks that are with you today, we are sleazy and slimy. And we're
ambulance chasing.
Trying to get people off. We know our client is guilty. We're using every trick of the trade. And so it seems ridiculous because the people who are supposed to be making these decisions, even like when they're appointed, or in the case with the public, when we're the voters, when we're voting, you would think that people would actually try to find out about people and see what's happening. But people see prosecutor and they think that's a person who stands for the truth, right? And they see defense attorney and they think that's a person who lets the bad people get away. And so they automatically think that that's who they should vote for. But yes, we're in court all the time, and we are at the young age when a lot of our, people we saw as prosecutors are now judges. And we know how they were as prosecutors, and they're on the bench, and most of them is no different than they were as prosecutors, but they just happen to be on the bench. That's the experience that I have, spanning this 26 years of doing this work.
You just, I was just reminded, I had to go pull it up in my phone right quick. I think I sent you this email, the email about Justice Jeffrey Johnson. Yes. Do you guys know who that is, Rachael?
Mm-hmm.
So you know about what happened to him, right?
Yeah, and I can't speak on it.
Yeah, well, don't talk about it then. But yeah, so judges do bad things too. So that's all I'm going to say. Judges do bad things too. But I am really, really invested in educating folks about not just voting for someone because their last name is Brown or Jackson or Johnson, when you look at who's running for what office, but actually, if you can't do the research yourself, going to like a Langston or a Jasmyne or whoever is following who the judges are and telling you like, look, hey, don't vote for this person. But we don't do that. And then we either just, like I said, skip over it all together, or we just kind of try to figure out, ooh, that looked like a black name. That looked like a Latinx name. Okay, I'm going to vote for them. And they could be the most conservative person that you're electing. And mostly like what I see coming out of LA County is that we elect prosecutors as judges. And that's, I'm just like, if we really want to change the system, we really need to stop doing that.
And I think another thing, Jasmine, as attorneys, it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're educating the community about the judges and who they are and their background to like help, because how would you know if if you're not in the legal profession and you go to the voting booth and you just see these names, you have no idea who these people are. So I know organizations like Langston, Cable, Black Women Lawyers, MAVA, we need to do a better job as well of making sure that we're doing outreach programs. We're going into churches. We're going into the community to say, look, this is what we know, and we'll answer questions and try to help you make that ultimate decision, especially when it comes to who the judges are and their background, and then also with different propositions where we can explain, look, this is what this language means. Because, a lot of times it's drafted in a way to be confusing. Right. And I do take that responsibility on us to make sure that we're helping our community understand before they go into the voting booth. But
you know what, Jamon, I just want to add to that. I think that we're going to have to we may have to do this as a separate entity. And the reason I say that is, and I don't know because I haven't been around these associations in a long time, but my recollection is that a lot of these associations are filled with prosecutors.
I was just about to say that.
And those prosecutors are not going to have the same message as us. They're going to want to have good people on both sides conversations. Yes. And so I really think at some point that Black defense attorneys, we're going to have to say, not that you have to leave these organizations, but there are some things that we can tell our people only in the way that we can tell them. And there is so much. I mean, where is the Langston Bar statement on George Floyd that's publicized to the world, or any of these other groups? And I'm not trying to pick on them. They just happen to be the one that's here. But a lot of times it's difficult for them. From the time of Rodney King, long ago, before y'all was born, we haven't had that strong presence. We got 5 Black bar associations, but we don't have that strong presence in our community, really speaking out about police crime, speaking out about what's happening in these court systems, because half of the people in them are prosecutors. A quarter of them used to be cops. And so I'm not mad at them. They're not going to speak against themselves. But what are we doing as defense attorneys to kind of be a little more courageous and to challenge ourselves to be willing to speak up?
Well, I will say that I understand your point about Langston. I think historically you're absolutely correct that especially 30 plus years ago, the majority of those attorneys that were involved in Langston were on the government side and not necessarily in the private sector. I have seen that there has been more outreach, especially to younger attorneys now that are in different areas of the law, not just government, but that are in the big firms, that are in mid-sized firms. So I do get that. But where I do agree with you, too, is oftentimes our programs, our panels, we're kind of preaching to the choir, right? Like we're talking to other attorneys and each other, and we do have to do a better job of putting on seminars in the community.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I also, while I have the 3 of you here, I really want to get your thoughts on, let me see if I can make this, because we have about 10 minutes left. I want to get your thoughts on, do we need an independent prosecutor's office here in the county and the state of California? And what do you see as the way for us to get there, to get that done? If you do think that we need one.
Okay.
Because you might not think we need one.
I'm gonna let the folks that aren't sitting right next to you talk first. If I get some space to say something, I will. Go ahead.
Rachel, take it.
So I think under the structures and the systems that we have today, absolutely. I do think that there are many ways that we can get at the problem, but the problem is we have a district attorney who works very closely with law enforcement and also works very closely with and is very heavily supported by law enforcement unions, who is then called upon to decide whether to prosecute law enforcement.
Hold
and
on
so
one
the structures
second.
as we have them.
Hold on 1 second. What do you call that, Nana?
Bonnie investigating Clyde.
Yes. Okay. Keep going.
Yes. Thank you. Well said. And so based off of the structures that exist now, we have a conflict of interest. And so I do believe that we need an independent body to be the body that's investigating, but we also need an independent prosecutor to be the one who's making the decision on whether or not to criminally prosecute law enforcement. I think that the ways it could happen, there's many ways. I think the Attorney General could grant authority to make that happen right now. I think legislation could make that happen. I think there are a lot of different ways, and I'm actually hopeful because we see the Congressional Black Caucus here in California introducing legislation on this issue. We see our mayor talking about this issue. This wasn't something that was so widely accepted as an idea even just a few months ago, and now it is something that a lot of people are talking about. So I do think that the time is ripe to have a conversation about what are the best ways to truly have independent review of these cases. But I do think that, we talk about is qualified immunity, getting rid of that enough? No. Is finding a way to ensure that prosecutions are brought against law enforcement criminally enough? No. There's a lot that needs to be done to overall equalize a system that has for a very long time elevated law enforcement up here and placed regular folks like us down here. And that system has permeated through confidentiality laws, through so many different rules, laws, regulations, policies throughout the systems that we operate under, that it needs to be a comprehensive approach. And we need to have everybody, all hands on deck in this conversation, talking about what can we do to really hold law enforcement accountable.
Rachel, you ran a really, really great campaign for district attorney, and I know that you're still engaged in this campaign, just in terms of who our next district attorney is going to be here in LA County. And so, looking at Jackie Lacey, looking at George Gascon, I think with Jackie Lacey, I think we'll all agree we'll never get support for an independent prosecutor coming from her. But even with George Gascon, I know he had something similar up in San Francisco, but it wasn't completely independent, right? It was still in his office.
Yeah, so if you want to get into the nitty gritty of it, what some prosecutors have done across the country is create a separate office within their office that is independent. And each office that has been created to do this function looks a little bit different. So right now, our district attorney has a separate office that is for law enforcement prosecutions and for integrity investigations for corrupt officials, right? But it isn't independent at all. And then there's different layers of independence that you can create within that office, where you could have it geographically separated. You could have attorneys in that office that aren't allowed to talk to the attorneys in the rest of the office. But what some advocates have criticized is that when you still have the same prosecutor on top who is still in charge of that office, you still have that conflict of interest. So I think there's layers, and we have to push for as far as we can get, and we have to go as far as we can. But we have to look at what exactly is the reform, what's it going to do, and how independent is this investigation?
Yeah. Nana, Jamon?
So a long time ago, not that long ago, let me not lie. I used to be a person who was assertive about having an independent prosecutor. But now, since I want to just tear the whole thing down, I feel like that's another space for them to just put more money into and play more games with. So I'm like, let's actually not do that. In the process of getting rid of the police and in the process of getting rid of this criminal sanction system, let's treat them like we treat everybody else. Let's not create a special place for them where Olivia and all of them get to be. Let's just have Olivia be right there next to Nana and Jasmine, set to the same rules, and
Olivia,
your girl, Olivia Benson. That's right.
Just leave her alone
until
leave
we can just take her job away. I think the independent prosecutor is another way that can be used and manipulated to keep and bolster this system. And I want this system to come down. So, my perspective on it has changed.
Okay. Jamon?
I'm open to the idea, obviously, of an independent prosecutor, whether that's through the Attorney General's office, whether that's through some new body. I want to learn more about that. I know Rachel and I have talked about that, and I've sought her guidance on it because I think Rachel knows much more about how that can be achieved. But the current route is not working because the officers are not being charged, and by not even being charged, all we're relying on is the civil process, the civil lawsuit process.
Right.
So I'm open to hearing ideas. I don't have the answers as to what I think is the right way to do it, but I definitely am open to hearing different ideas about how this independent prosecution will work and how it will be funded and where these attorneys will come from. I've heard before, like, if you liken it to the public defender's office, we have a public defender and an APD, but then I do share Nana's concerns about, okay, well, if you're just having it be a branch that's off of the district attorney's office, is it really going to be independent? So I would need more information, but it is something that I'm looking into, and I want to learn more about it because something's got to change.
People's Tribunal. That's what I think we should have. People's Tribunals.
Well, you want to bring back the guillotine? I don't know.
No, because I'm trying not to shame and blame people. I'm an abolitionist. But people's tribunals for cops and prosecutors, I think that would be fabulous.
Oh, okay. So my final question for all of you is going to be, and I know it's kind of like a loaded question, but just how do you think, what can the average person sitting at home do right now to help get either a change to qualified immunity or get or help eliminate it? What is it that they need to do, in your opinion?
Well, as Rachel pointed out, since we're talking about federal right now, since federal qualified immunity can only be changed by Congress or the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court usually doesn't respond to those letters, contact the Senate, especially your senator, and press, and contact other people's senators. Get your friends in other places.
Your
federal.
Right. Okay. Because
yes.
we have a state
yes.
senator.
Yes. You're federal. Excuse me. Yes. Thank you. So your senator in Congress on the Hill. Contact that person, and then find out like who is bucking up against this. And if you have friends, relatives, comrades that are in those places, have them call that senator. Right. Because with California, we do have Harris, but we also have Feinstein. I don't know how she ruled on this. So we may have to be pushing some people.
Rachel.
I agree. Get involved by calling not only your senators, which I actually do think is important. Even if you do think that your senators on your same page, sometimes they will prioritize things when they look at, I'm getting the most calls or emails about this issue, I'm going to prioritize this issue. So I do think calling your own senator, whether they're good or bad on this issue, is important. And then also partnering with friends, colleagues in other states is very important. And I'll just say this, vote. It's so important to look at every player. Now, we're talking about qualified immunity in federal law, but every player in our local government also has a say in law enforcement accountability, from the mayor to the board of supervisors to the local legislators, the local senators. Our mayor appoints the chief of police. Our sheriff is an elected position. There is so much that we can do if we educate ourselves and we vote in every single one of these local elections. It's incredibly important.
And Jamon?
I agree with what was said. I think the only thing I would add to what was already said is, again, you get that federal notice to go to jury service. Please respond. Please show up. Take it seriously. And I am happy to see that this new movement is encouraging these types of discussions in a way that I haven't seen it before. So we got to continue these discussions. We got to keep educating ourselves, keep educating each other, and making this a priority, not losing the momentum that we already have.
I agree. Well, thank you so much, Nana, Rachel, Jamon. You three are, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, you are three of the most brilliant attorneys that I know. I know your time is very valuable. I appreciate you for not charging me for this hour. Thank you so much.
You didn't know. Look at your PayPal and see if you don't have a bill from the three of us. I hooked it up, Rachel and Jamon. Don't worry.
I appreciate you so much. Next week, I'm looking to have a discussion around why the news media always just believes everything the police say, even when they know they lie.
Great question.
And it's time we have a discussion about the news media's role in criminal justice reform and police accountability and police reform as well. Like I said before, we all have a role in this, right? So that's going to do it for this edition of Str8 No Chaser. I want to thank Felicia, Poetess Morris, and Morris Media Studios in Leimert Park for having me. Thank you so much. You can follow me on social media. I'm Jasmine on Twitter. I'm Hello Jasmine on Instagram. Follow me on Facebook. If you have any questions about today's show, leave them in the comments section. We will respond to them later. And I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Thank you again so much.
Thanks for having us, Jasmine.
Thank you.
Jasmine.